On our last episode of James Bond Revisited, we kicked off the Pierce Brosnan era in high style with the triumphant GoldenEye, which broke franchise records in the fall of 1995. So it was a given at this point that the franchise was going to continue with Pierce Brosnan, and work began on a follow-up film due for Christmas of 1997. However, they were about to run into an iceberg with James Cameron's Titanic opening in movie theaters on the very same day as Tomorrow Never Dies. Would James Bond be able to face off with his biggest foe ever? Find out in this week's episode of James Bond Revisited, Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, in this one, James Bond must stop Rupert Murdoch from taking over the world. Well, okay, not exactly Rupert Murdoch, but Elliot Carver, as played by Jonathan Pryce, definitely does seem based on Rupert Murdoch to some degree. And in the film, the character wants to begin a world war with China.
There's no news like bad news.
So, I have to say, Tomorrow Never Dies is never going to be thought of as one of the better James Bond films. The reason why is that it was a very, very troubled production. Roger Spottiswoode, who used to be the editor for Sam Peckinpah, signed on to direct, and indeed has directed some pretty cool movies like Air America. But he apparently had a very tense relationship with his cast and crew, including Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan has gone on record saying that Tomorrow Never Dies was far from a pleasant shoot. One of the big issues with the movie, of course, though, was the fact that they just could not get the screenplay right no matter what they did. There were so many hands being put into this film. So many people had to have their say on this movie, and I guess everybody just really wanted to rush this out to capitalize on the success of GoldenEye, but they probably should have waited another year, because a rush job never really delivers a great James Bond film. The movie cost $110 million. By comparison, GoldenEye cost less than half that. And if you watch the two movies together, GoldenEye seems a lot more lavish, doesn't it? This, notably, was the first film to be made after the death of Albert R. Broccoli, and not having him around probably made the film a little bit of a harder production to get going. So tons of people were involved in the script on this movie, including James Bond historian John Cork, Richard Smith, and even novelist Donald Westlake, who ended up turning his story for the film that was turned down into a novel called Forever and a Death. Bruce Firestein, who wrote GoldenEye, was the one who eventually ended up getting the credit, and he said that the title, Tomorrow Never Dies, was actually inspired by the Beatles song Tomorrow Never Knows. They actually were going to call the film Tomorrow Never Lies, but when they faxed it to MGM, there was a smudge and it read as Tomorrow Never Dies, which was a title MGM found quite attractive, and they decided to use it. But the title had no relation to Ian Fleming's life or work, which was kind of a one-off because usually they're somewhat related. Now, Pierce Brosnan, before this film was made, always told people that he wanted Quentin Tarantino to direct a James Bond film, he wanted Anthony Hopkins to play the villain, and he wanted Sharon Stone to play the James Bond girl. Now, that would have been really cool, but in 1997, it would have been probably the most expensive James Bond movie ever made, and unfortunately, Eon was never going to let Quentin Tarantino direct, because if he did direct, it would have been far from a typical James Bond film.
Filthy habit.
They were just getting back into the swing of things, and they didn't want to take any risks. Logically, they probably should have gone to Martin Campbell, but alas, he was busy at the time doing The Mask of Zorro. Funny enough, with Anthony Hopkins, who would be the one person from Pierce Brosnan's Dreamcast that would actually be approached. They wanted him to play Elliot Carver, but alas, he was too busy. Natasha Henstridge was apparently at one point the frontrunner to play the lead James Bond girl, and Monica Bellucci came very close to playing Carver's wife Paris, but apparently was turned down by the producers because they felt she was too old. In 1997, she was only in her early 30s, and what's odd is that years later, probably 20 years after this, she would end up playing a Bond girl. So there you go. She was not too old. What a strange, strange twist. Of course, Teri Hatcher ended up playing that part, and Teri Hatcher's career was white hot at the time because she was on Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, and was kind of the it girl of the moment. Michelle Yeoh, who had kicked everybody's ass in Jackie Chan's Super Cop, was pretty hot at the moment, and she was signed on to play Colonel Wei Lin, a skilled Chinese spy who would become James Bond's ally and the de facto Bond girl, and almost steals the movie from Pierce Brosnan, I have to say. So looking at Tomorrow Never Dies, what's wrong with it? A couple of things. For one thing, the storyline is kind of silly. It's very clear that they based the villain on Rupert Murdoch and whatever. He's trying to make tomorrow's headlines today so that he could get a jump on the news and start war with China. I mean, okay, fine, fair enough. Roger Spottiswoode, who I think is probably a good action director, didn't really have, I don't think, what it takes to make a James Bond movie. And Tomorrow Never Dies ranks as one of the shortest James Bond movies, running under 2 hours. And I remember gasping when I saw it in theaters because Roger Spottiswoode's name is superimposed over the first scene of the movie after the opening title credit sequence, which I always thought was a really kind of baller move, but also very egotistical. So the film was flawed, nobody got along, and apparently Pierce Brosnan and Teri Hatcher were at each other's throats throughout filming. Although Teri Hatcher was pregnant at the time, apparently Pierce Brosnan didn't know this and was quite sheepish afterwards and apologized. There were even rumors that Jonathan Pryce and Pierce Brosnan didn't get along, and I remember on the Rosie O'Donnell show they did an episode dedicated to Tomorrow Never Dies, and Pierce Brosnan kind of made a big show about having fun with Michelle Yeoh. The two of them really loved each other, but then when Jonathan Pryce came to give his interview, Pierce Brosnan mysteriously disappeared, and Rosie O'Donnell even addressed it on an episode saying, oh no, there's been rumors that Pierce Brosnan and Jonathan Pryce don't get along, but it's not true. The two of them, however, didn't seem to be especially chummy, and I think the problem though, more than anything, was the fact that Roger Spottiswoode in the book Some Kind of Hero really didn't seem to get along with anyone. Judi Dench apparently absolutely despised the man. Barbara Broccoli wasn't a big fan either, and it's not a surprise that he never really came back and directed another James Bond film, although he's had a pretty good career since. Who knows? I think there's a lot of cooks in these productions, and I think that it was probably not the easiest shoot or the easiest job to do, and I think they were maybe foolish to only give it a 2-year turnaround, considering that it took 6 years to get GoldenEye off the ground. So, the finished film is a very flawed production, but it's not a disaster. As I said, Roger Spottiswoode definitely knows how to construct an action scene, and while the storyline is a little bit dumb, it's nonetheless a fairly entertaining film. It's one of the most action-heavy installments of the franchise up to that point, and the action scenes are impeccable, including an awesome car chase where James Bond steers the car from the backseat using his cell phone. While it would have been nice, of course, if the film had a little more substance, I still think it's superior in some ways to the Brosnan films that followed, although I have to say it was a major disappointment coming off of the solid GoldenEye. And I remember going to see it in theaters and being a little bit underwhelmed, although of course there were things about it that I like. So let's break it down. How good is Pierce Brosnan as James Bond in this film? He's good. Not as good as he was in GoldenEye though. He's put on a little bit weight, his hair is not quite as badass as it was in the first movie, and he doesn't seem to be as engaged with the material. I think it was a harried production, and in some ways he seems a little bit exhausted and kind of annoyed with how things are going on film. So he's not quite as sharp as James Bond in this one, but he would bounce back. He was really good in the next 2 James Bond movies, even though they weren't particularly great movies. This is the first of the James Bond movies though where Brosnan starts to play the role a little bit tongue-in-cheek, although you can't really blame him considering the movie itself. He seems a little bit winky-wink at the audience. But there are still a couple of solid scenes where Brosnan actually gets to act, including a great scene where he calmly kills an unarmed villain played by Vincent Schiavelli.
Wait! I'm just a professional doing a job!
Me too.
For the most part though, he's just shooting guns and dropping one-liners. So Pierce Brosnan's performance this one gets about a 7 on 10. The villains are very mixed bag in this movie. Jonathan Pryce, who I think is a great actor and, deserved his Oscar nomination for The Two Popes and was really good in Brazil, of course, plays Elliot Carver, again, Rupert Murdoch.
Terrible conflict looms tonight in the South China Sea, which, unchecked, has the potential to destroy every human being on Earth.
I like Pryce, but I think that Carver is absolutely one of the worst James Bond villains of all time. Not a physical threat, not an intellectual threat. I feel like he's a sidekick that should have been dispatched earlier on.
Pathetic.
You can say that again, pal.
In fact, I think the best villain in the movie is probably Ricky Jay as an arms dealer, because he's a magician. And apparently there were even scenes from the movie that were cut where Ricky Jay uses his card skills to try and fight James Bond. Might have been a little too silly. So the villain in this one gets about a 5 on 10. Bond girls, however, in this movie are pretty good.
Was it something I said?
How about the words, "I'll be right back"?
Teri Hatcher isn't great as Paris Carver. I don't think she was fully engaged by the role. I don't think she had a lot to do in this movie. She seems a little bit bored. I think Monica Bellucci would have been a better choice. However, Michelle Yeoh really kicks ass in this movie as Wei Lin and probably deserved a spin-off of her own. And in fact, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson pitched such a spin-off to United Artists, but they turned it down. I think because they didn't think that Michelle Yeoh could carry a franchise, even though she was one of the biggest movie stars in the world at the time. Very strange. I'm a lifelong Hong Kong action film fan, and I love Michelle Yeoh. The problem is, though, of course, she's not the traditional Bond girl. Her romantic chemistry with Brosnan is okay, but it's not great, and she almost kicks too much ass because it becomes more of a Wei Lin movie than a James Bond movie to some degree. He is, I have to say, overshadowed probably for the first time ever by a Bond girl in this movie. And her action scenes are a lot better than his. I mean, she can really move. There's a scene where she just decimates a warehouse full of bad guys, which is pretty badass. Pierce Brosnan comes in and punches one of them out, but that's about all he does. That said, though, there are still some good Brosnan action scenes, including that great car chase and another motorcycle chase where the two of them are handcuffed together and they're flipping around and doing all kinds of stuff. It's pretty awesome.
Don't get any ideas.
I'd never dream of it.
So the Bond girl in this movie, Michelle Yeoh alone, gets a 9 on 10, although, again, she's not your traditional Bond girl.
Up on your left.
One of the things I really like about this movie is the musical score. David Arnold at the time was a rising composer, having gained some fame for doing the score for Stargate and Independence Day. He was really up and coming, and at the time he did this James Bond album called Shaken and Stirred, where he recruited a bunch of Britpop singers to kind of get together and do covers of James Bond songs. He did some really good work in it with the Propellerheads, Pulp, and a couple of other really cool bands, including Iggy Pop, who did a great cover of We Have All the Time in the World that was so good it showed up in a movie years later. The Jacket with Adrian Brody. Very strange. His orchestrations were kind of badass, and I think that he got the attention of Eon Films with that CD, and I think that his score for Tomorrow Never Dies is his best in his long tenure with James Bond. He's not John Barry, but he's closer to John Barry than a lot of other composers got. His action scenes are great. He has that great backseat driver cue with the propeller heads, and Moby also does a remix of the James Bond theme in this that's really cool. I mean, it's very 90s, but it's pretty awesome. In addition to David Arnold's score, we get a couple of really great theme songs. There's Sheryl Crow's Tomorrow Never Dies, which is kinda too 1997 for James Bond, but there's a really good theme song at the end called Surrender by Katie Lang, which was written by David Arnold, and really should have been the main theme song, but for some reason they wanted to go with Sheryl Crow, who was really big at the time. In terms of one-liners, there's not too much here. James Bond gets a good one off when he throws a bad guy into a printing press and says,
They'll print anything these days.
There is a great double entendre, however, when Moneypenny discovers that James Bond is taking language lessons and has spent the morning having sex with his language tutor, who's played by Bryan Adams' wife, a really famous model named Cicely Thompson. She says to him,
You always were a cunning linguist, James.
Holy shit, I cannot believe they got away with this. One thing that's also worth mentioning is that there was a lot of these bit players that went on to serious fame afterwards. So Julian Fellows, who created Downton Abbey, plays the British Minister of Defense that Bond's kind of mouthing off to at the beginning. Hugh Bonneville from Downton Abbey, of course, also is an army officer. And then there's Jared Butler as a seaman in the film. Pretty cool. Now, where this movie kind of really starts to take off also are the gadgets. Q provides James Bond with this cell phone that allows him to operate his new BMW from the back seat. And of course, yes, this is another James Bond movie where we don't get an Aston Martin, we get a BMW. That was kind of a staple of the Brosnan era. Sadly, this would be the last film where Q would be on his own. In the next movie, The World Is Not Enough, he'd be saddled with John Cleese's annoying R, and of course that would turn out infamously to be his swan song, as Desmond Llewellyn passed away not long afterwards. He still seems to be having a lot of fun here though, and I remember the VHS was kind of cool because Desmond Llewellyn actually does a little bit of an intro and tells people to look forward to the next James Bond movie, which came out something like 22 months after this. It's insane how quickly they were churning these out in the 90s. So Tomorrow Never Dies, despite facing off with Titanic at the box office, was actually a pretty big hit. It pulled in $126 million in the US, which was better than GoldenEye did, and about $333 million worldwide, which I don't think was quite as good as GoldenEye did, but was pretty successful nonetheless. Of course, Titanic went on to become the biggest film of all time, whereas Tomorrow Never Dies is kind of a footnote in the James Bond series. I give this James Bond installment a middling 6 on 10, but it's still fairly good and better, unfortunately, than some of the Brosnan installments that were to follow. But we'll talk about those in our next episode of James Bond Revisited. Thank you for watching James Bond Revisited. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our channel, tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.